Everyone knows Hollywood was built by Jewish immigrants, but nobody tells you how Jewish. In 1930, every single major studio, MGM, Paramount, Fox, Universal, Warner Brothers, was founded and run by Eastern European Jews. Every single one, but there's one family that stands apart. The Warners didn't just build a studio, they invented sound, the jazz singer. The first talking picture in history. They made movies that told America what to think about gangsters, about war, about race. They turned Humphrey Bogart and James Dean into gods. Bugs Bunny, Warner Brothers, Casablanca, Warner Brothers. Here's the part nobody knows. 4 brothers from Poland, sons of a cobbler who fled pogroms with nothing, fought their way into an industry that tried to destroy them, then spent the rest of their lives trying to destroy each other. If you love these hidden dynasty stories, consider subscribing, because what the Warner Brothers did to each other makes Game of Thrones look tame. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Warner Brothers movies have reached every corner of the globe. Benjamin, Warner never planned to build a dynasty. He was just trying to keep his children alive long enough to escape Poland. Born Benjamin von Skalaza in 1857 in the tiny Shtetl of Krasnasielc, he grew up in a world where being Jewish meant living on borrowed time. This was Russian-controlled Poland, a place where the Tsar's government treated Jews as subhuman, where your village could be burned to the ground because a bureaucrat in St. Petersburg decided it was time to remind the peasants who to blame for their misery. Benjamin learned to repair shoes from his father, a trade that kept the family fed but never comfortable, a skill that required him to kneel before customers and work leather until his fingers cracked and bled. He married a woman named Pearl Leah Eichelbaum when he was barely 20 years old, and together they started having children in a place where children were both a blessing and a liability because every new mouth to feed was another soul you might have to watch die. The first son came in 1881. They named him Hirsch, though the world would come to know him as Harry. Then came Albert in 1884, then Shmuel in 1887, who would become Sam, and the family kept growing even as the world around them kept threatening to collapse. You need to understand what life looked like in a Polish shtetl during this period. The village of Krasnasielc had maybe 2,000 people, most of them Jewish, crammed into wooden houses along muddy streets that turned to rivers when it rained. There was no running water, no electricity, no hope of advancement. The local economy ran on small trades and desperate commerce, Jews selling to Jews because the Christian population wanted nothing to do with them, except when they needed a scapegoat. Benjamin repaired shoes 6 days a week, observed Shabbat on the 7th, and watched his children multiply while his prospects remained frozen. Then came the pogroms. The 1880s were a nightmare for Jews across the Russian Empire. After Tsar Alexander II was assassinated in 1881, the government decided that Jews were somehow responsible, and they unleashed waves of organized violence that swept through hundreds of communities. These were not random riots. These were coordinated attacks, often led by police, where mobs would descend on Jewish neighborhoods, destroy businesses, burn homes, beat men to death in the streets, and assault women while authorities watched or participated. The message was unmistakable. You are not welcome here. You will never be safe here. Leave or die. Benjamin heard the stories filtering in from other villages. Accounts of families wiped out overnight, of synagogues torched, of children orphaned and elders murdered. He watched his own community live in perpetual terror, never knowing if tonight would be the night the mob came for Krasnasielc. The psychological weight of this existence is almost impossible for modern viewers to comprehend. Imagine raising children while genuinely believing that soldiers might arrive at any moment to kill them. Imagine going to sleep every night wondering if you would wake up to screaming and fire. Imagine looking at your sons and knowing that their futures, if they had futures at all, would be defined by fear and flight. This was the world Benjamin Warner inhabited, and it forged something in him that would pass down through generations. A desperate, relentless drive to escape, to survive, to build something that could never be taken away. By 1889, Benjamin had made his decision. He would go to America. Not the whole family, not yet, because there was no money for that. He would go alone, find work, save every penny, and send for his wife and children one by one until they were all free. This was the pattern for millions of Jewish immigrants during this period. Fathers leaving first, enduring years of separation, living in squalor to accumulate enough dollars to bring over the next family member. Benjamin sold everything he could, borrowed what he could not sell, and scraped together enough for a one-way ticket to Baltimore. He was 32 years old, he spoke no English, he had never been more than 50 miles from the village where he was born, and he was about to cross an ocean alone to a country that he knew only from rumours and letters from distant relatives. The journey itself was brutal. Steerage class on a transatlantic steamship meant 2 to 3 weeks in the bowels of the vessel, packed together with hundreds of other desperate emigrants in conditions that would be illegal for transporting livestock today. Disease spread easily, food was scarce and often rotten, seasickness was universal. Many passengers died during the crossing and were buried at sea. Benjamin survived and arrived at the port of Baltimore sometime in late 1929. Stepping onto American soil with almost nothing in his pockets and absolutely no idea what came next. What came next was years of grinding labour. Benjamin found work as a cobbler, the only trade he knew, repairing shoes in a city where thousands of other immigrants were competing for the same menial jobs. He lived in a boarding house with other Jewish men, sharing cramped rooms, eating the cheapest food available, and saving every cent that did not go to absolute necessities. His English came slowly, painfully, word by word learned from customers and fellow workers. He wrote letters to Pearl back in Poland, letters that took months to arrive, telling her he was alive, he was working, he was saving, she should be patient. Those letters were the only connection he had to his family for years. He did not see his children grow, he did not hold his wife. He existed in a state of suspended animation, working not to live but to accumulate enough to bring one more person across the ocean. Let me give you the numbers on Jewish immigration to America during this period. Between 1880 and 1920, approximately 2.5 million Eastern European Jews fled to the United States. In 1880, there were about 250,000 Jews in America. By 1920, there were 3.6 million. That is a 1 through 40% increase in 40 years. Most arrived with nothing. The average immigrant family had less than $15 in savings. The Warner family arrived with even less. Benjamin's trade as a cobbler meant he earned roughly $8 to $10 per week in Baltimore. Average rent was $3 to $4 weekly. That left maybe $20 to $25 per month for a family that would eventually include 12 children. Every extra dollar went back to Poland to bring over the next family member. It took Benjamin 7 years to reunite his family. 7 years of separation, letters that took months, uncertainty whether everyone would survive. This was the crucible that forged the Warner brothers. Pearl arrived with the younger children around 1890. The older boys came in stages as Benjamin could afford their passage. By 1896, the entire family was finally together in America, but Baltimore offered limited opportunities, so they moved. First to Youngstown, Ohio, where Benjamin tried to establish a shoe repair business, then to other towns in the Midwest, following rumors of work, chasing the promise of stability that always seemed just out of reach. The family tried everything. Benjamin opened a butcher shop that failed. He tried selling goods door to door. The older boys, Harry and Albert, worked whatever jobs they could find to supplement the family income. They delivered ice, repaired bicycles, sold trinkets on the street. Nothing worked for long. The Warners were surviving, but they were not advancing. They had escaped the pogroms, escaped the Russian Empire, escaped the death sentence of being Jewish in Poland, and they had arrived in a country that did not particularly want them either. American anti-Semitism in the 1890s was pervasive and vicious. Jews were excluded from most professional jobs, barred from many neighborhoods, denied admission to universities and social clubs. The Warner boys grew up knowing they were outsiders, knowing that the American dream everyone talked about was not really meant for people like them. But something else was growing in those years of struggle. The brothers were developing distinct personalities that would later define their business empire. Harry, the eldest, became the de facto patriarch after Benjamin. He was serious, responsible, conservative, the one who worried about money and propriety. Albert was quieter, more methodical, comfortable working behind the scenes. Sam was different. Sam was curious, restless, fascinated by technology and novelty. He was the brother who took things apart to see how they worked, who wandered into situations the others would have avoided, who saw possibilities where his siblings saw only problems. And then there was Jack. Born in 1892 in Canada during one of the family's wandering periods, the youngest of the 4 brothers who would matter. Jack was a performer from birth, theatrical, attention-seeking, desperate to be noticed. Where Harry commanded respect through gravity, Jack demanded it through volume. These 4 boys, shaped by pogrom terror and immigrant poverty and the constant pressure of being outsiders, would eventually build one of the most powerful entertainment empires in history. But in 1903, they were still nobody, just another struggling immigrant family, the father working himself to exhaustion, the mother Pearl holding everything together through sheer force of will, the sons taking odd jobs and dreaming of something better, without any clear idea of what that something might be. Then Sam Warner saw a travelling movie show. It came through Youngstown or Niles or one of the other Ohio towns the family passed through during those years, a small operation with a projector and some short films, the kind of entertainment that was popping up across America as the new century began. Sam watched moving images flicker on a screen, people and places captured in light, stories told without words, and something clicked in his brain. This was new. This was technology. This was a business that did not require you to have connections or a family name or a prestigious education. This was something an outsider could do. Sam went home and told his brothers what he had seen. He told them this moving picture thing was going to be big, bigger than anyone realised, and that they needed to get into it now before everyone else figured it out. Harry was sceptical. Albert was cautious. Jack was probably too young to be consulted. But Sam would not let it go. He had seen the future, and the future moved at 24 frames per second. By 1903, the Warner family had survived pogroms, survived immigration, survived poverty, but they were still nobody, just another immigrant family scrambling for pennies. That was about to change. Because Sam Warner had seen something that would alter the trajectory of entertainment history, a moving picture. What he did next would make the family either rich or ruined. There was no middle ground. The Edison Trust tried to destroy the Warner brothers before they could even start, so the brothers decided to fight the most powerful monopoly in America. It began in 1903 with a used Kinetoscope projector that Sam Warner found for sale in a pawn shop or a second-hand store. The historical record is unclear on the exact source, but what matters is the price, $150. That was everything the Warner family had saved. Every penny Benjamin had scraped together repairing shoes, every dollar the older boys had earned delivering ice and selling goods door to door, every cent Pearl had hidden away for emergencies, $150 for a battered projection machine and a single print of a film called The Great Train Robbery. Sam convinced his brothers this was not madness but opportunity. Harry resisted at first because Harry always resisted anything that smelled like gambling, but Sam had a way of making people see what he saw, and what he saw was an industry being born. The Great Train Robbery was only 12 minutes long, a simple story of bandits robbing a train and getting caught, but audiences in 1903 had never seen anything like it. People screamed when the outlaw pointed his gun directly at the camera. They gasped at the action sequences. They paid money, real money, to see it in the dark and watch light flicker on a screen. Sam understood that this reaction could be monetized, and he understood that the Warner family had nothing to lose by trying. The brothers converted a storefront in Niles, Ohio, into a makeshift theatre. They hung a sheet on one wall, set up chairs, and charged 5 cents admission. Sam ran the projector because he was the only one who understood how it worked. Harry collected money at the door. Albert and Jack did whatever needed doing. The first screenings were chaotic, the projector breaking down constantly, the film tearing, the audience sometimes demanding refunds, but enough people paid that the brothers could see the potential. They started touring, loading the projector and film reels into a wagon, and travelling from town to town across Ohio and into Pennsylvania, showing the Great Train Robbery in empty stores, in tents, in any space where they could hang a sheet and charge admission. This was the Nickelodeon era, named for the 5-cent admission price, and it was transforming entertainment across America. Before movies, working-class people had limited options for amusement. Vaudeville theatres charged too much. Saloons offered distraction, but not spectacle. The Nickelodeon gave immigrants and factory workers something they had never had before: cheap, accessible, democratic entertainment that required no English language skills to enjoy. A Polish family fresh off the boat could sit next to an Irish dock worker and an Italian seamstress, and they could all laugh at the same pratfalls, gasp at the same chases, cry at the same melodramas. The Warners, themselves immigrants who remembered what it felt like to be excluded, understood this audience intuitively. They knew what it meant to want escape from grinding poverty, to crave stories of adventure and romance and triumph against odds. They were not selling film, they were selling dreams to people who desperately needed them. By 1905, the brothers had saved enough from their touring operation to open their first permanent theatre in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. They called it the Cascade Theatre, a grand name for what was essentially a converted storefront with wooden chairs and a second-hand projector. But it was theirs, a fixed location where they could show films every day instead of wandering from town to town. Harry handled the finances, negotiating rent, managing expenses, keeping meticulous records of every nickel that came in and went out. Albert took over distribution, figuring out how to get films to show, building relationships with the exchanges that rented prints to exhibitors. Sam maintained the equipment and scouted new technologies, always looking for ways to improve the picture quality, the sound accompaniment, the overall experience. Jack was still young, barely a teenager, but he was already showing the showman instincts that would define his later career, standing outside the theatre hawking the show, learning how to draw a crowd through pure force of personality. The Cascade Theatre succeeded, so they opened another, then another. By 1907, the Warners operated 5 theatres across Pennsylvania and Ohio. They were making money, real money, more than Benjamin had ever earned repairing shoes, more than the family had ever seen, but there was a problem, and the problem was Thomas Edison. The Edison Trust, formerly known as the Motion Picture Patents Company, was a cartel formed in 1908 that controlled virtually every aspect of the film industry. Edison held patents on movie cameras and projectors, and he had licensed these patents to a small group of established producers and distributors who agreed to play by his rules. If you wanted to make films, you needed Edison equipment, which meant you needed Edison approval. If you wanted to show films, you needed to rent from Edison-approved exchanges, which meant paying whatever prices they demanded. The trust charged licensing fees of $2 per week per projector, and they required exhibitors to rent only from approved sources at significant markups. Any independent operator who tried to work outside this system faced lawsuits, equipment seizures, and sometimes physical intimidation. Edison had hired detectives and enforcers who would show up at independent theatres and smash projectors, destroy prints, threaten owners with violence. The trust was a monopoly in the purest sense, designed to crush competition and extract maximum profit from everyone involved in the movie business. The Warners faced a choice. They could submit to the trust, pay the fees, accept the restrictions, and remain small operators dependent on Edison's goodwill, or they could fight. You need to understand the psychology of this decision. These were men who had fled pogroms, who had crossed an ocean with nothing, who had watched their father sacrifice years of his life to bring a family to safety. They had already risked everything multiple times. They had already survived situations where submission meant death. The trust was powerful, but it was not Cossacks on horseback burning villages. The trust could take their money and their equipment, but it could not take their lives. This calculus, invisible to people who have never faced real persecution, shaped everything the Warner brothers did. They were willing to gamble because they knew what actual danger felt like, and business risk did not compare. The brothers decided to move up the supply chain. If the trust controlled exhibition through distribution, then they would become distributors themselves. In 1912, they formed the Duquesne Amusement Supply Company, a film exchange based in Pittsburgh that would rent prints to theatres across the region. This was a direct challenge to the trust's control, and it required them to source films from the independent producers who were also fighting Edison's monopoly. A network of rebels was forming, Jewish immigrants mostly, men who had come from similar backgrounds, who understood each other, who trusted each other because they had no one else to trust. The film industry in these early years was remarkably Jewish, not because of any conspiracy, but because of circumstance. Established industries were closed to Jews through formal and informal discrimination. Banking, law, medicine, academia, all had barriers that kept outsiders out. But movies were new, disreputable, associated with immigrants and working-class amusements. The respectable Protestant establishment wanted nothing to do with flickering images and converted storefronts. That left an opening, and Jewish entrepreneurs rushed through it. Carl Laemmle, William Fox, Adolf Zucker, Louis B. Mayer, the Warners, all of them immigrants or children of immigrants, all of them building empires in an industry that polite society considered beneath contempt. They supported each other because they had to. When Edison's thugs came after one independent, the others rallied. When the trust filed lawsuits, the independents shared lawyers and strategies. This was not altruism. This was survival. The Nickelodeon economics tell the story of why the fight was worth it. In 1905, there were roughly 100 movie theatres in America. By 1910, there were over 10,000. Admission price was 5 cents, hence the name Nickelodeon. A single theatre could seat 200 people, run 8 shows daily, and gross $80 per day. Weekly revenue could reach $500. Weekly costs for rent, film licensing, and staff ran between $150 and $200. That meant $300 or more in profit weekly, potentially $15,000 annually, from one small theatre. The Warners started with one theatre and expanded to 5 by 1907. But here is the real math that explains why independence mattered. Edison's trust charged licensing fees of $2 per week per projector, plus required exhibitors to rent films only from trust-approved exchanges at 25% markups. The Warners were paying Edison more than $500 annually per theatre just for the privilege of operating. Breaking free meant keeping that money, and the trust would do anything to stop them. The legal battles dragged on for years. The trust sued independent producers for patent infringement. They sued exhibitors for using unlicensed equipment. They filed injunctions, seized property, deployed every weapon in their legal arsenal. But they made a critical mistake. They were so focused on protecting their monopoly that they forgot to innovate. Trust films were short, formulaic, indistinguishable from one another. The independents, fighting for survival, took risks. They made longer films, told more complex stories, created stars that audiences would pay specifically to see. The independents were also fleeing west. California offered distance from Edison's New York base, favourable weather for year-round filming, and diverse landscapes that could double for anywhere in the world. A place called Hollywood, a dusty suburb of Los Angeles, became the centre of independent production. The Warners did not relocate immediately, but they watched what was happening. They saw the future taking shape 3,000 miles away. By 1915, the trust was weakening. Antitrust lawsuits filed by the federal government were grinding through the courts. Audiences had grown tired of trust productions and were flocking to independent features. The stars the independents had created, people like Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin, commanded loyalty that no trust film could match. In 1918, the Supreme Court ruled against the Motion Picture Patents Company, finding it in violation of antitrust law. The trust collapsed. Edison, who had invented so much of the technology that made movies possible, was out of the movie business entirely. The independents had won. The Warners emerged from this period transformed. They had started as exhibitors, then become distributors, and now they were ready to become producers. Harry had developed financial expertise that would serve the company for decades. Albert had built distribution networks across the country. Sam had mastered every technical aspect of filmmaking, from cameras to projectors to developing processes. Jack had honed his promotional instincts, learning how to sell a show, how to create excitement, how to make people want to see something before they even knew what it was. The four brothers had found their roles, and those roles would define Warner Brothers for the next 40 years. But they were still small, still marginal, still fighting for attention in an industry that was exploding with competition. Everyone was making silent films. The technology had not fundamentally changed in 20 years. What the Warners needed was something revolutionary, something that would make every other studio obsolete overnight. Sam Warner had been experimenting with a technology everyone else had dismissed as a gimmick. They called it a fad that would never catch on. They said audiences did not want to hear actors talk, that silence was part of the magic, that synchronized sound was a technical curiosity with no commercial future. Sam called it the future. He was about to bet the entire company on it. Every major studio rejected sound technology as a fare, so Sam Warner mortgaged everything the family owned to prove them wrong. By 1925, Warner Brothers had been in business for nearly 2 decades, but they remained the smallest of the major Hollywood studios, a scrappy independent operation perpetually on the edge of financial collapse. The big studios, Paramount and MGM and Fox, had resources the Warners could only dream about. They had theatre chains, distribution networks, contracts with the biggest stars, relationships with the banks that financed the industry. Warner Brothers had none of that. What they had was 4 brothers who refused to quit and a willingness to take risks that more established competitors would never consider. That willingness was about to be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. Sam Warner had never stopped tinkering, never stopped searching for the next technological breakthrough that might give his family's studio an edge. In early 1925, he attended a demonstration in New York of something called the Vitaphone system, developed by Western Electric and Bell Telephone Laboratories. The technology used large phonograph discs synchronized with film projection to produce sound that matched the images on screen. Other studios had seen similar demonstrations and dismissed them. Sound was a gimmick, they said. Audiences did not want to hear actors talk. The magic of cinema was in the silence, in the orchestras that played live accompaniment, in the title cards that audiences had learned to read. Besides, converting to sound would cost a fortune. Every theatre in America would need new equipment. Every studio would need new recording technology. Foreign markets, which accounted for a huge percentage of Hollywood revenue, would become problematic because audiences in France and Germany and Japan could not understand English dialogue. The established studios looked at sound and saw only risk, expense, and the potential destruction of a business model that was already making them wealthy. Sam looked at sound and saw the future. He came back from that demonstration burning with conviction. He told Harry and Albert and Jack that this was it. This was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. This was how Warner Brothers could leap past the competition in a single bound. Harry was skeptical. Harry was always skeptical of Sam's enthusiasms because Harry was the one who had to find the money, who had to negotiate with banks, who had to sign personal guarantees that put the family's entire fortune at risk. Warner Brothers was already struggling financially. They had overextended trying to compete with the majors, acquiring theatres and production facilities they could barely afford. The books showed losses. The creditors were getting nervous. This was not the time, Harry argued, to gamble millions on an unproven technology that every other studio in Hollywood had rejected. Sam would not let it go. He argued with Harry for months, presenting data, making projections, insisting that sound was inevitable, and that the only question was whether Warner Brothers would lead the revolution or be destroyed by it. The fights became personal. Sam accused Harry of being a coward, of lacking vision, of being willing to let the family's studio die a slow death rather than take a chance on life. Harry accused Sam of being reckless, of being willing to bankrupt the entire family on a hunch. Albert tried to mediate. Jack stayed out of it, as Jack often did when his older brothers fought. Finally, Sam issued an ultimatum. Either the company invested in sound or he would leave. He would take his technical expertise elsewhere, find partners who shared his vision, and Warner Brothers could continue making silent films until the industry passed them by. Harry faced an impossible choice. Lose Sam, whose technical genius had driven the company's success from the beginning, or bet everything on a technology that might not work. He chose to bet. The brothers put up everything as collateral. Their theatres, their production facilities, their personal homes, their savings, every asset the Warner family had accumulated over 2 decades went on the line to secure loans for the Vitaphone investment. If sound failed, they would lose everything. There would be no second chances, no rebuilding, no starting over. Benjamin and Pearl's sons, who had escaped pogroms and crossed oceans and fought the Edison Trust and clawed their way into the movie business, would be ruined. The total investment came to approximately $3 million, an almost incomprehensible sum for a studio their size. They signed contracts with Western Electric. They built sound stages. They developed new production techniques because recording sound required completely different approaches than silent filmmaking. Cameras had to be enclosed in soundproof booths because their motors were too loud. Actors had to stay near microphones that could not move. Directors had to reconceive how they staged scenes. Everything was harder, slower, more expensive. The technical challenges were immense, and Sam Warner threw himself into solving them with obsessive intensity. He worked 18-hour days. He slept at the studio. He supervised every aspect of the sound recording process, making adjustments, solving problems, pushing his team to achieve quality that would silence the skeptics. His brothers watched him deteriorate physically, losing weight, looking exhausted, but Sam refused to slow down. He believed he was racing against time, and he was right, though not in the way he thought. The first major Vitaphone release came in August 1926, a film called Don Juan starring John Barrymore. Don Juan was not a talking picture in the sense we understand the term today. It had no spoken dialogue. Instead, it featured a synchronized orchestral score and sound effects, eliminating the need for live musical accompaniment in theatres. The premiere was a sensation. Audiences marvelled at the perfect synchronization between image and sound, at the richness of the orchestral music, at the novelty of hearing effects that matched what they saw on screen. Critics praised the technical achievement. The film performed well at the box office. But it was not the revolution Sam had promised. Don Juan proved that synchronized sound worked, but it did not fundamentally change the movie-going experience. You could still watch the film with live orchestra accompaniment and have essentially the same experience. What Sam needed was something that could only exist with sound. Something that would make silent films obsolete, not through novelty, but through necessity. He found it in a Broadway star named Al Jolson. Jolson was the biggest entertainer in America, a vaudeville and musical theatre performer whose energy and charisma had made him a legend. He was also Jewish, the son of a cantor from Lithuania, and his signature performances involved blackface, the theatrical tradition of white performers darkening their skin to portray black characters. This tradition was deeply embedded in American entertainment, a legacy of minstrel shows that dated back to before the Civil War. Jolson's blackface performances were considered the height of entertainment in the 1920s, though modern audiences rightly view them as racist artifacts of a shameful era. The Warner brothers were making a business decision, not a moral statement. Jolson could sing, could talk, could connect with an audience in ways that silent film stars could not. He was the perfect vehicle for sound. The Jazz Singer was based on a play about a cantor's son who defies his father to become a jazz singer, a story that resonated deeply with immigrant Jewish audiences who understood the tension between tradition and assimilation. The production budget was $422,000, a significant sum but not extraordinary by Hollywood standards. What made The Jazz Singer different from Don Juan was the decision to include actual spoken dialogue. Not much dialogue, only about 2 minutes total, but enough to transform the experience completely. The most famous moment came when Jolson, in character as Jack Robin, finishes a song and turns to the audience. Wait a minute, he says. You ain't heard nothing yet." Those words, improvised by Jolson during filming, changed cinema forever. They were not in the script. The plan had been for another synchronized score with songs but no talking. But Jolson was a performer who could not help engaging with his audience, and he started ad-libbing between numbers, talking to his on-screen mother, making jokes, being himself. Sam Warner, watching the footage, recognized what he had captured. This was not a novelty, this was a new art form. He kept the dialogue in the final cut, and that decision ended the silent era. The premiere was scheduled for October 1627 at the Warner Theatre in New York. Sam Warner would not be there. In the weeks leading up to the premiere, Sam's health had collapsed. The years of overwork, the stress of the sound gamble, the physical toll of his obsessive schedule had caught up with him. He developed severe headaches. Doctors discovered an infection that had spread to his brain, a condition called mastoiditis that had progressed to a brain abscess. Surgery was attempted but unsuccessful. Sam Warner died on October 5, 1927, the day before The Jazz Singer premiered. He was 40 years old. He never heard an audience react to the revolution he had created. He never saw the lines around the block, never read the ecstatic reviews, never witnessed the industry he had helped build transform overnight. The brother who had seen the future more clearly than anyone, who had risked everything and fought everyone to make sound a reality, died before he could enjoy his triumph. Harry and Albert and Jack attended Sam's funeral in Los Angeles, while The Jazz Singer opened in New York. They buried their brother and then they counted their profits. The sound revolution numbers are staggering, and they tell the story of what Sam's vision accomplished. The cost to convert one theatre to sound was approximately $15,000 to $25,000. The number of theatres in America in 1927 was roughly 20,000. The total industry conversion cost therefore ran between $300 million and $500 million, equivalent to $5 to $7 billion in today's money. Warner Brothers' investment in Vitaphone was approximately $3 million, every dollar the family had. The Jazz Singer production budget was $422,000. The total box office gross exceeded $3.5 million, and this representing an 835% return on production investment. But here is the real devastation that reshaped Hollywood. Within 2 years of The Jazz Singer, silent film production dropped from 100% to essentially zero. Careers ended overnight. Stars who could not speak English fluently or who had poor voices or heavy accents found themselves unemployable. Studios that could not afford the conversion to sound went bankrupt. The major companies that had dismissed sound as a fad now scrambled to catch up, spending hundreds of millions on equipment and facilities while Warner Brothers enjoyed a 2-year head start. Warner Brothers went from near bankruptcy in 1925 to industry dominance by 1930. Revenue grew from $9 million in 1926 to $230 million by 1930. That is 2,456% growth in 4 years. The company that had been the smallest of the majors became one of the most powerful studios in Hollywood, all because one brother saw what others could not and convinced his family to bet everything on his vision. The jazz singer's legacy is complicated in ways that extend beyond its technical achievement. The film's use of blackface, central to both the story and Jolson's performance style, is deeply troubling to modern viewers. Jolson himself had a complex relationship with black culture and black performers. He advocated for black artists, helped integrate Broadway, and was reportedly beloved by many in the black community during his lifetime. But his performances relied on a tradition rooted in the dehumanization of black Americans, a tradition that reduced black identity to caricature for white entertainment. The Warner Brothers, Jewish immigrants who understood persecution, were nonetheless participants in a system that oppressed others. This tension between Jewish advancement and black exploitation in American entertainment would recur throughout Hollywood history. The brothers who fled pogroms built an empire partly on the cultural theft of black artistic expression. There is no way to celebrate the jazz singer's technical revolution without acknowledging the moral compromise embedded in its content. Sam Warner was buried the day the jazz singer premiered. He was 40 years old, the brother who had seen the future, who had gambled everything on sound or never heard an audience react to his revolution. But his death created something else, something that would poison the Warner family for decades. Sam had been the bridge between Harry and Jack, the mediator who could translate between Harry's financial conservatism and Jack's creative ambitions, the technical genius whose authority both brothers respected. With Sam gone, there was no buffer. Harry and Albert and Jack now had to divide Sam's responsibilities and credit among themselves. They had to decide who deserved recognition for the sound revolution, who would control the studio's direction, who was really in charge. The fights that followed would define Warner Brothers for the next 40 years, because without Sam to mediate, Harry and Jack were about to discover how much they truly hated each other. While America starved during the Depression, Warner Brothers discovered that desperation was good for business if you gave people the right kind of escape. The stock market crashed in October 1929, and within months the American economy collapsed into the worst crisis the nation had ever experienced. Banks failed by the thousands. Unemployment soared to 25%. Families lost homes, farms, savings, everything they had built over generations. Breadlines stretched around city blocks. Shanty towns called Hooverville sprang up in parks and vacant lots. The American dream that had drawn millions of immigrants like the Warners to this country seemed to be dying. Other studios panicked. They cut production, laid off workers, retreated into safe formulas that they hoped would not alienate what remained of their audience. The conventional wisdom said that entertainment was a luxury, that people struggling to feed their families would not spend money on movies, that Hollywood needed to hunker down and wait for better times. The Warner Brothers saw it differently. Harry and Jack and Albert looked at the Depression and saw not a disaster but an opportunity. They understood something about their audience that more established studios had forgotten. The people who went to Warner Brothers Pictures were not the wealthy elites who attended MGM premieres. They were factory workers and shop clerks and immigrant families, people who lived in cramped apartments in crowded cities, people who worked long hours for low wages when they could find work at all. These people did not need movies less during the Depression. They needed movies more. A quarter bought 90 minutes of escape from a world that had become unbearable. A quarter bought warmth in a heated theatre when you could not afford to heat your own home. A quarter bought dreams when reality offered only nightmares. Warner Brothers accelerated production while competitors retreated. They made films faster, cheaper, and more relevant to the moment than anyone else in Hollywood. And they found genres that spoke directly to an audience that felt forgotten and betrayed by the American system. The gangster film became Warner Brothers' signature during the early Depression years. Little Caesar in 1931 starred Edward G. Robinson as Rico Bandello, a small-time criminal who rises to the top of the underworld through ruthlessness and ambition. The Public Enemy the same year made James Cagney a star as Tom Powers, a street kid who becomes a bootlegger and dies in a hail of bullets. These films were violent, amoral, thrilling. They showed men who came from nothing and grabbed everything, who refused to accept the limitations society placed on them, who lived large and died young rather than grinding out respectable poverty. Critics and moralists condemned the gangster pictures as glorifying crime, but audiences understood something the critics missed. The gangsters were them. The gangsters were immigrants and children of immigrants, men with funny names and rough manners who would never be accepted by polite society no matter how hard they worked or how well they behaved. The gangsters looked at a system rigged against them and decided to rig it back. They were outlaws, yes, but they were also rebels against an economic order that had just destroyed millions of lives. When Rico Bandello snarled at the world, audiences who had lost their jobs and their savings and their faith in the future felt that snarl in their bones. The gangster films always ended with the criminal dead or captured because the production code demanded it, but the journey to that end was what mattered. For 90 minutes, the little guy won. The Warner style crystallized during these years into something distinct from every other studio in Hollywood. MGM made glossy fantasies with beautiful stars in beautiful costumes living beautiful lives. Paramount made sophisticated comedies for cosmopolitan audiences. Warner Brothers made films that felt like they were shot in the streets outside your apartment. The lighting was harsh. The dialogue was fast and hard, overlapping conversations that sounded like real people actually talked. The settings were recognizable. Tenements and squeezies and factory floors and unemployment offices. The characters were working class or criminal class, people who sweated and struggled and cursed. There was an urgency to Warner Pictures, a sense that they were ripped from headlines, that they were about now rather than some fantasy past or imagined future. This style was partly aesthetic choice and partly economic necessity. Warner Brothers did not have the money for elaborate sets and costumes, so they shot fast and cheap on standing sets that could be redressed and reused. They could not afford long production schedules, so directors learned to work quickly, to get scenes in 1 or 2 takes, to keep the camera moving and the story racing forward. The limitations became virtues. The speed and roughness that came from budget constraints gave Warner films an energy that more polished productions lacked. Jack Warner ran the studio with an iron fist during these years, and his management style was as brutal as the films he produced. He negotiated contracts that bound actors to the studio for years at salaries far below their market value. He punished stars who demanded better terms by suspending them without pay, by assigning them to terrible projects, by loaning them to other studios for films he knew would damage their careers. He feuded constantly with the talent that made his studio successful. James Cagney fought with Jack Warner throughout the 1930s over money and roles. Bette Davis sued the studio to escape her contract and lost, then came back and became their biggest female star while hating Jack Warner every moment. Humphrey Bogart spent years in thankless supporting roles before finally getting his break, and he never forgot how the studio had treated him. Jack believed that actors were commodities, interchangeable parts in a machine that he controlled. He was wrong about that, but his wrongness did not stop him from building the most distinctive stable of talent in Hollywood. The actors who worked for Warner Brothers during the Depression years defined screen personas that endure to this day. Cagney was the electric tough guy, coiled with energy, capable of exploding into violence or charm with equal intensity. Robinson was the cultured gangster, intelligent and dangerous, a wolf in expensive suits. Bogart was the cynical romantic, wounded by the world but still capable of honor. Davis was the fierce independent woman, refusing to be decorative, demanding to be taken seriously. These performers did not emerge fully formed. They were shaped by the films Warner Brothers made, by the directors and writers who worked with them, by the studio system that both exploited and elevated them. The contract player system was oppressive, but it also provided steady work and the opportunity to develop craft across dozens of films. An actor at Warner Brothers in the 1930s might appear in 6 or 8 pictures a year, learning on screen what later generations would study in acting classes. Warner Brothers also pioneered the backstage musical, a genre that combined the escapism of song and dance with the gritty realism the studio did best. Second Street in 1933 told the story of a Broadway production struggling to open during hard times, with all the pub drama happening behind the curtain and as much as on stage. The choreography by Busby Berkeley was revolutionary, using cameras in ways no one had imagined, creating kaleidoscopic patterns of dancers that could only exist on film. Gold Diggers of 1933 was even more explicit in its depression commentary, including a show-stopping number called "Remember My Forgotten Man," that depicted unemployed veterans begging in the streets while chorus girls sang about the promises America had broken. These musicals gave audiences spectacle and escape, but also acknowledged the reality they were escaping from. They were not pretending the Depression did not exist. They were transforming it into art. The Depression-era numbers reveal the strategy behind Warner Brothers' success. Weekly movie attendance in New 30 reached 80 million Americans, 65% of the entire population. Average ticket price was 25 cents. Total industry revenue hit $1 billion annually during the worst economic crisis in American history. Warner Brothers' film output ran between 60 and 80 pictures per year, more than one per week. Average production budget ranged from $200,000 to $400,000. Average return was 2.5 times budget. The hit ratio was remarkable. Warner Brothers produced 7 of the top 20 grossing films between 1930 and 1935. Key titles included Little Caesar at $1.5 million gross, Public Enemy at $1.7 million, 42nd Street at $2.3 million, and Gold Diggers of 1933 at $3.4 million. But the real business model was vertical integration. The studio owned 525 theatres by 1930. Every film had guaranteed distribution through Warner-owned venues. Competitors without their own theatre chains could not match this advantage. The Warners made films for their theatres and filled their theatres with their films, a closed loop that maximised profit at every stage. Harry Warner involved himself increasingly in politics during the 1930s, becoming an enthusiastic supporter of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. Harry saw in Roosevelt a kindred spirit, a leader who understood that unregulated capitalism had failed and that government needed to protect ordinary people from economic catastrophe. The Warners made films that supported New Deal programs and values, pictures that depicted the struggles of working people with sympathy, and that suggested collective action and government intervention as solutions. This was unusual for Hollywood moguls, most of whom were conservative Republicans suspicious of anything that smelled like socialism. Harry did not care. He had seen what unregulated power could do, both in the pogroms of his childhood and in the economic collapse of his adopted country. He believed in using the studio's influence to advocate for the vulnerable. The Production Code of 1934 created new challenges for Warner Brothers' style of filmmaking. The code was Hollywood's system of self-censorship, implemented to fend off government regulation and religious boycotts. It prohibited explicit violence, sexual content, profanity, and any depiction of crime that did not clearly show criminals being punished. The gangster films that had made Warner Brothers famous were suddenly problematic. You could no longer show a criminal enjoying his success, even briefly. You could no longer depict the allure of the outlaw life. Everything had to be framed as moral lesson, cautionary tale, warning against sin. The Warners pushed back against the code more aggressively than any other studio, finding loopholes, testing boundaries, arguing with censors. They shifted their focus from gangsters to law enforcement, making films like G-Men where Cagney played an FBI agent instead of a criminal, using the same violent energy in service of the state rather than against it. They made prison pictures and social dramas that depicted harsh conditions and systemic injustice while technically staying within code guidelines. They found ways to be subversive within the constraints, to say things the code was designed to prevent. As the 1930s progressed, Harry Warner became increasingly obsessed with the rise of fascism in Europe. He watched Hitler consolidate power in Germany. He read reports of persecution against Jews. He understood, in a way that many Americans did not, what the Nazi regime represented and where it was heading. In 1939, Warner Brothers released Confessions of a Nazi Spy, the first major studio film to explicitly attack Hitler and the Nazi movement. The film depicted German-American Bund activities in the United States, showing Nazi sympathizers as traitors and spies. It was controversial, provocative, and commercially risky. Germany and German allied countries immediately banned all Warner Brothers pictures, cutting the studio off from significant international markets. Other studios criticized the Warners for mixing politics with entertainment, for risking industry revenue on ideological crusades. Harry did not care. He had seen fascism before, wearing different uniforms, speaking different languages. He knew that silence in the face of such evil was complicity. Warner Brothers continued making anti-Nazi pictures throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s, building a reputation as the studio willing to take stands that others would not. By 1941, Warner Brothers had survived the Depression stronger than ever. They had built a factory that produced stars and genres and social commentary at industrial scale. They had created a style that audiences recognized and loved, a voice that spoke to working people and immigrants and anyone who felt like an outsider in America. They had made money while doing it, proving that commercial success and social conscience were not incompatible. But war was coming, a war that would demand everything Hollywood had to give. Warner Brothers would throw itself into that conflict more aggressively than any other studio, mobilizing its resources for propaganda and training films and morale-building entertainment. What they did during World War II would cement their reputation forever as the studio that stood for something beyond profit, but it would also bring them under government investigation from the very people they were trying to help. Because the same passion that made Harry Warner hate Nazis would make him a target of senators who saw in his crusade something sinister, something un-American, something that needed to be stopped. The United States Senate accused Harry Warner of warmongering and trying to drag America into war, 3 months before Pearl Harbor proved him right. In September 1941, a subcommittee of the Senate Interstate Commerce Committee convened hearings to investigate what they called war propaganda in motion pictures. The targets were obvious. The major Hollywood studios, most of them owned and operated by Jewish immigrants, that had been making films critical of Nazi Germany. The subcommittee was led by isolationist senators who believed America should stay out of European conflicts, who suspected that Jewish studio heads were manipulating public opinion to serve foreign interests, who saw in Hollywood's anti-Nazi pictures evidence of a conspiracy to drag the nation into a war that was not its concern. The hearings had an unmistakable anti-Semitic undertone that everyone recognized but few openly acknowledged. Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota, one of the investigation's architects, had publicly complained about Jewish influence in the film industry. Senator Bennett Champ Clark of Missouri made similar insinuations. The message was clear even when it was not stated directly. These foreigners, these Jews, were using their control of American entertainment to manipulate patriotic citizens into fighting for causes that benefited their tribe rather than their country. Harry Warner was called to testify, and he did not flinch. He understood exactly what was happening, understood that he was being accused of dual loyalty, of caring more about Jews in Europe than Americans at home. He had heard these accusations before in different languages, in different countries. He had fled them as a child. He would not flee them now. Harry's testimony was defiant, passionate, and unapologetic. He declared that he was ready to give himself and all his personal resources to aid in the defeat of the Nazi menace, to the American system of government and the American way of life. He rejected the premise that warning Americans about Nazi aggression constituted propaganda. He argued that films like Confessions of a Nazi Spy were not warmongering, but truth-telling, that the studios had a responsibility to alert the public to dangers that isolationist politicians preferred to ignore. He was an American, he insisted, and he would use every tool at his disposal to defend America against its enemies, whether those enemies came from abroad or from within. The senators pressed him, questioned his motives, implied that his Jewish identity made him incapable of objective judgment about European affairs. Harry held his ground. He would not apologize for making films that attacked Nazism. He would not pretend that Hitler was anything other than a mortal threat to everything America claimed to stand for. If that made him a propagandist, then so be it. He would rather be a propagandist for democracy than a silent collaborator with fascism. The investigation was still ongoing when Japanese planes appeared over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The attack killed over 2,000 Americans, destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet, and instantly transformed American public opinion. The isolationism that had fueled the Senate investigation evaporated overnight. The senators who had accused Harry Warner of warmongering suddenly looked foolish at best and treasonous at worst. The hearings quietly dissolved without reaching any conclusions. America was at war, and the studios that had been warning about fascism for years were vindicated. Warner Brothers threw itself into the war effort with an intensity that matched Harry's personal conviction. The studio converted to wartime production almost immediately, dedicating significant resources to military training films, propaganda shorts, and morale-building entertainment. The Army and Navy needed instructional materials for millions of recruits who had to be trained quickly in everything from aircraft recognition to venereal disease prevention. Hollywood had the technical expertise and production capacity to create these materials at scale, and Warner Brothers led the way. Between 1942 and 1945, the studio produced over 200 training films for the military, more than any other company in Hollywood. These were not glamorous projects. They did not win awards or generate box office revenue. But they were essential to the war effort, teaching young men how to identify enemy aircraft, how to maintain equipment, how to survive in combat conditions. The studio's sound stages and backlots were repurposed for military training exercises. The Army Air Corps used Warner Brothers facilities for aircraft recognition courses. Jack Warner, ever the showman, personally commissioned the construction of air raid shelters on the lot because he believed the studio would be a Japanese target. He was probably wrong about that, but the shelters demonstrated the seriousness with which the Warners took their wartime role. Featured film production did not stop during the war. It actually increased. Warner Brothers released 52 films in 1943 alone, maintaining their position as one of Hollywood's most prolific studios while simultaneously supporting military production. The films changed to reflect wartime concerns. Combat pictures, home-front dramas, and morale boosters dominated the release schedule. The gritty realism that had defined Warner Brothers during the Depression translated naturally to war stories. The studio knew how to depict struggle, sacrifice, and ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. One wartime production became the studio's most enduring legacy, though no one involved understood its significance at the time. Casablanca began as a routine project, one of dozens of pictures in development during 1942. The source material was an unproduced play called Everybody Comes to Rick's. The script went through multiple writers. The casting was unsettled until shortly before production began. Humphrey Bogart was assigned the lead role of Rick Blaine, a cynical American nightclub owner in Vichy, controlled Morocco, who becomes entangled in the escape of a resistance leader. Ingrid Bergman played Ilse Lund, Rick's former lover who reappears with her husband, the resistance hero Victor Laszlo. The production was chaotic. The script was being rewritten during filming. Actors often did not know how scenes would end when they started shooting them. The famous final scene at the airport was decided only days before it was filmed. Nobody involved thought they were making anything special. It was just another picture, another assignment, another product rolling off the Warner Brothers assembly line. What emerged was something miraculous, a film that captured the moral complexity of wartime with grace and intelligence that transcended its B-movie origins. Casablanca was about sacrifice, about choosing principle over personal happiness, about finding reasons to fight when cynicism offered easier comfort. Rick's journey from selfish neutrality to committed resistance mirrored America's own journey from isolationism to engagement. The film's famous ending, in which Rick gives up the woman he loves so she can continue the fight against fascism, resonated with audiences who were themselves being asked to sacrifice for causes larger than individual happiness. The dialogue was quotable, the performances were iconic, and the whole thing worked in ways that nobody could have planned or predicted. Casablanca became not just a hit, but a cultural touchstone, the definitive American film about World War II, a picture that would be watched and quoted and referenced for generations. Its success was accidental genius, the product of talented people working under pressure with incomplete materials while somehow creating art that transcended its origins. Not all of Warner Brothers' wartime productions aged as well. Mission to Moscow in 1943 was made at the explicit request of the Roosevelt administration, which wanted Hollywood to produce films that would build public support for America's alliance with the Soviet Union. The picture depicted the Soviet system in absurdly favourable terms, whitewashing Stalinist purges and presenting the USSR as a democracy striving for peace. It was propaganda in the most literal sense, designed to manipulate rather than inform, to serve government objectives rather than artistic truth. Harry Warner approved the project because he believed in supporting the war effort and because the administration asked. He did not fully understand or did not fully care about the moral compromises involved in presenting Stalin's regime as benevolent. The Soviet Union was fighting Hitler, which made them allies, which made propaganda on their behalf acceptable in wartime logic. This decision would haunt the studio for years. When the Cold War began and anti-communist hysteria gripped America, Mission to Moscow became evidence that Hollywood had been infiltrated by Soviet sympathizers. The film that had been made at government request to support government policy would be used to accuse the studio of communist influence. The wartime production numbers reveal the scale of Warner Brothers' mobilization. Between 1942 and 1945, the studio produced over 200 training films for the military, more than any other company in Hollywood. feature film output actually increased during the war years, with 52 pictures released in 1943 alone. Casablanca had a production budget of $964,000 and grossed $3.7 million at the box office, a 383% return on investment. The film received 8 Academy Award nominations and won 3, including Best Picture, but the war effort extended far beyond theatrical releases. The studio employed 6,000 workers at peak wartime production. They manufactured aviation training equipment on the lot. They produced V for Victory shorts that played before features across the country. They opened their facilities to the Army Air Corps for specialized training programs. Jack Warner personally oversaw the construction of defensive measures on studio property. The total Warner Brothers financial contribution to war bonds and relief efforts exceeded $10 million. Harry Warner personally donated $500,000 to organizations assisting refugees fleeing Nazi persecution. The family that had fled pogroms 50 years earlier was now using its wealth and influence to help others escape similar horrors. The war also touched the Warner family directly. Jack Warner Jr., Jack's son from his first marriage, served in the military during the conflict. The relationship between Jack and his son had always been difficult, marked by the Jack's neglect and emotional distance, but the war created common ground. Jack Jr.'s service gave his father something to boast about, proof that the Warners were not just making films about sacrifice, but actually sacrificing themselves. The complicated feelings between father and son would continue after the war, but for a few years they were united by a shared enemy and a shared cause. Jewish Hollywood had a complicated relationship with depicting Jewish persecution during the war years. The studios, almost all run by Jewish immigrants or their children, were acutely aware of anti-Semitic accusations that they served Jewish rather than American interests. They feared that films focusing on Jewish suffering would confirm these suspicions, that audiences would dismiss Nazi atrocities as Jewish concerns rather than universal human rights violations. As a result, wartime films rarely depicted the specific targeting of Jews by the Nazi regime. They showed generic victims, generic refugees, generic persecution. The Holocaust was happening, millions of Jews were being murdered in camps across Europe, and Hollywood largely avoided mentioning it directly. This silence was partly self-protective, partly a reflection of broader American indifference to Jewish suffering, partly a failure of imagination about the scale of what was occurring. The Warners, who understood better than most what Hitler meant for Jews, nonetheless made films that soft-pedaled the specifically Jewish dimension of Nazi crimes. They fought fascism, but they fought it in ways that minimized their own people's particular victimhood. Whether this was cowardice or strategy or simply the limitations of wartime understanding, it represents a complicated legacy that cannot be easily judged from the comfort of historical distance. The war ended in 1945 with the defeat of Germany and Japan. Warner Brothers emerged from the conflict at its patriotic peak. They had been right about Hitler when isolationists were wrong. They had supported intervention when others counselled neutrality. They had converted their studio to military production and created films that would endure for generations. Harry Warner could take satisfaction in knowing that his warnings had been vindicated, that his refusal to back down before the Senate investigation had been proven correct, that the studio he and his brothers had built had served its country in its hour of greatest need. But the post-war world had no patience for heroes and no memory for past sacrifices. The alliance with the Soviet Union that had justified mission to Moscow collapsed into Cold War hostility almost immediately. The same government that had requested pro-Soviet propaganda now viewed anyone who had produced such material with suspicion. The House Un-American Activities Committee, which had existed since 1938 but had been largely dormant during the war, began investigating communist influence in Hollywood. The senators who had accused Harry Warner of warmongering were gone, but new accusers were emerging, asking different questions but with the same underlying suspicion of Jewish Hollywood's loyalty and motives. And Jack Warner, who had always been more concerned with self-preservation than principle, who had watched his brother Harry face down the Senate in 1941 but had not possessed the courage to do the same, was terrified. He had approved mission to Moscow. He had employed writers and directors whose politics leaned left. He had built a studio that made socially conscious films about workers and outsiders and underdogs. All of that now looked dangerous. Jack Warner would do anything to avoid being associated with the communism he had inadvertently promoted. He would name names, he would betray colleagues, he would destroy careers to save his own. The House Un-American Activities Committee was coming, and Jack Warner was preparing to tell them everything they wanted to hear. Jack Warner was so desperate to prove his patriotism that he testified against his own employees, including people who were not even communists. The House Un-American Activities Committee came to Hollywood in October 1947 with a mission to expose what they claimed was communist infiltration of the American film industry. The committee had been investigating alleged subversion for years, but the post-war Red Scare gave their work new urgency and new public support. Americans who had fought alongside Soviet allies just 2 years earlier now viewed communism as an existential threat. The Cold War was reshaping every aspect of American life, and Hollywood, with its power to shape public opinion, became a natural target. The committee wanted to prove that communist writers and directors had been inserting propaganda into American films, poisoning the minds of moviegoers with subversive messages hidden in entertainment. They wanted names, they wanted confessions, they wanted to demonstrate that even the most patriotic-seeming institutions had been compromised by red influence. Jack Warner was among the first studio executives called to testify. He had requested the opportunity, in fact, eager to get ahead of any accusations that might be levelled against his studio. Jack understood his vulnerability better than anyone. Warner Brothers had made Mission to Moscow at government request, a film that now looked like Soviet propaganda. The studio had employed left-leaning writers throughout the Depression and war years, artists who had created the socially conscious pictures that defined the Warner brand. The same films that had attacked fascism and championed working people could easily be reframed as communist adjacent in the paranoid atmosphere of 1947. Jack decided that the best defense was overwhelming offense. He would not wait to be accused. He would accuse others first. He would prove his loyalty by demonstrating his willingness to purge disloyalty from his own ranks. His testimony before the committee was rambling, incoherent at times, and devastatingly specific at others. He named 16 writers he claimed were un-American, individuals he said had tried to insert communist propaganda into Warner Brothers pictures. He provided no evidence for most of these accusations. He could not point to specific scenes or dialogue that demonstrated communist influence. He simply named names, throwing employees to the wolves based on suspicion, rumour, and his own desperate need to appear cooperative. Some of the people Jack named had indeed been members of the Communist Party or affiliated organisations. Many had not. The Communist Party had been legal in the United States throughout the period in question. Membership was not a crime. Political belief was supposed to be protected by the Constitution. None of that mattered to the committee or to Jack Warner. The mere accusation was enough to destroy careers, to render talented professionals unemployable, to cast suspicion that could never be fully dispelled. Jack's testimony was particularly damaging because it came from a studio head, someone with intimate knowledge of production processes and personnel. When a writer's own employer accused him of subversion, that accusation carried weight that outside allegations lacked. Jack was not just naming names, he was validating the committee's entire premise, confirming that communist infiltration was real and that even major studios had been victimized. His eagerness to cooperate gave the investigation credibility it might not otherwise have possessed. The psychology of Jack's behaviour reveals something important about the vulnerability of Jewish studio heads during this period. The same anti-Semitic currents that had fueled the 1941 Senate investigation still flowed through American political life. Jews were perpetual outsiders, their loyalty always subject to question, their success always attributed to tribal manipulation rather than individual merit. The communist accusation carried special danger for Jewish executives because it echoed older anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish radicalism and Jewish disloyalty. Jack Warner had spent his entire life trying to prove he belonged in America, trying to demonstrate that he was a patriot despite his immigrant origins and his Jewish identity. The HUAC investigation threatened everything he had built, not just his studio, but his carefully constructed identity as an American success story. His response was to become more American than the Americans, more anti-communist than the committee members themselves, more willing to sacrifice others than anyone could have demanded. Fear drove him, the same fear that had driven his family out of Poland, but now directed inward against people who had done nothing wrong except share a political moment with him. The Hollywood 10 became the most famous victims of this blacklist, though they were far from the only ones. These were writers and directors who refused to cooperate with the committee, who declined to answer questions about their political beliefs and associations, who invoked their constitutional rights rather than naming names. The committee held them in contempt of Congress. They were tried, convicted, and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 6 months to 1 year. Their careers were destroyed. Studios that had employed them for years refused to hire them again. Some continued working under pseudonyms or through fronts, but most were simply erased from the industry they had helped build. Several of the Hollywood 10 had worked for Warner Brothers. Their names had appeared on scripts that Jack Warner had approved, on films that had made the studio money and won critical acclaim. These were not strangers. These were colleagues, collaborators, people Jack had worked alongside for years. His willingness to abandon them, to actively participate in their destruction, revealed something about his character that his brothers could not ignore. Harry Warner watched the HUAC spectacle with growing dismay. Harry had faced down the Senate in 1941. He had refused to apologize for making anti-Nazi pictures. He had declared his willingness to sacrifice everything in the fight against fascism. He understood what it meant to stand on principle against government persecution. What Jack was doing violated everything Harry believed about loyalty, about honor, about the obligations powerful people owed to those who depended on them. But Harry did not intervene. He did not publicly criticize his brother's testimony. He did not use his position as the eldest Warner to demand different behavior. His silence was its own kind of betrayal, a failure of moral courage that matched Jack's active collaboration. The brothers had always fought, but they had fought as brothers, within the bounds of family loyalty. Jack's HUAC testimony crossed a line that Harry could not forgive, even if he could not bring himself to publicly condemn it. The distance between them widened into something that felt permanent. While Hollywood convulsed with political persecution, another blow fell that would prove equally devastating to the studio system the Warners had helped create. The Paramount Decree issued by the Supreme Court in 1948 found that the major studios had violated antitrust laws through their ownership of theatre chains. The court ordered the studios to divest their theatrical holdings, to separate production from exhibition, to end the vertical integration that had guaranteed distribution for their films. This was exactly what the Edison Trust had done 40 years earlier, and the government was breaking it up for exactly the same reasons. The decree destroyed the business model that had made the studio system possible. Warner Brothers had owned 525 theatres by the end of the war, venues that showed Warner Pictures regardless of quality, that provided reliable revenue streams regardless of critical reception. Every film the studio made had guaranteed distribution through these theatres. Competitors without their own chains had to beg for screen time, had to accept whatever terms the majors offered, had to watch their pictures disappear if they failed to perform in the first week. The theatre ownership gave studios like Warner Brothers enormous power over the entire industry. Now that power was being stripped away by government order. The blacklist and antitrust devastation can be measured in numbers that reveal the scale of the catastrophe. The Hollywood 10 received prison sentences ranging from 6 to 12 months each. Careers destroyed by the blacklist numbered over 300 writers, directors, and actors. Jack Warner's HUAC testimony named 16 individuals, of whom only 3 or 4 had any documented Communist Party connection. The Paramount Decree forced Warner Brothers to divest 525 theatres worth approximately $35 million. Stock price dropped over 40% between 1948 and 1952. Studio revenue declined from $230 million in 1946 to $145 million in 1952. Employment cuts reduced Warner Brothers staff from 6,000 to 3,500 between 1947 and 1953. Production budgets dropped by an average of 25%. The new reality was stark and unforgiving. Without guaranteed theatrical distribution, every film was a gamble. The vertically integrated empire the brothers had spent 40 years building was dismantled by the government order. The irony of the Warner Brothers situation during this period was almost too painful to contemplate. These were men who had fled persecution in Poland. These were men who had fought the Edison Trust's monopoly power. These were men who had warned America about fascism when isolationists called them warmongers. These were men who had converted their studio to military production and made films that shaped how Americans understood their own sacrifice. They had spent their entire lives fighting for justice, for the underdog, for the right of outsiders to succeed in America. Now one of them was participating in the persecution of others, naming names, destroying careers, collaborating with a government inquisition that used many of the same tactics the brothers had fled as children. The films Warner Brothers had made during the Depression celebrated people who refused to submit to unjust authority, the gangsters who defied corrupt systems. the working people who organized against exploitation, the individuals who stood up for principle against power. Now, the studio that had made those films was purging anyone who had taken their messages too seriously, anyone who had actually believed that challenging the established order was admirable rather than subversive. Jack Warner became what Warner Brothers films had always opposed, a powerful man using his power to crush the vulnerable. Harry's silence made him complicit. The studio that had defined itself through social conscience was now enforcing social conformity. The brothers who had built an empire on outsider energy were now policing the boundaries of acceptable belief. Television emerged during these years as both threat and opportunity. The new medium was draining audiences from movie theatres, offering free entertainment in people's homes that competed directly with paid theatrical exhibition. Studios that had dismissed television as a fad, much as they had dismissed sound 20 years earlier, now scrambled to adapt. Some resisted, refusing to sell their film libraries to networks, treating television as an enemy to be defeated. Warner Brothers, perhaps remembering how Sam's embrace of new technology had saved them before, took a different approach. They began producing content for television, creating shows that could reach audiences who no longer went to movie theatres regularly. This adaptation helped the studio survive the transition, though it could not restore what had been lost. The theatrical exhibition business would never again be what it had been before the Paramount Decree and the rise of television. The studio system that had defined Hollywood for 3 decades was dying, replaced by something messier and less controlled, an industry where independent producers and talent agencies would eventually hold more power than the great studios. By the mid-1950s, Warner Brothers was wounded but surviving. The blacklist would eventually fade as McCarthyism exhausted itself and Americans grew tired of persecution. Television was providing new revenue streams that partially compensated for declining theatrical attendance. The studio was adapting, as it had always adapted, finding ways to remain relevant in a changing entertainment landscape. But inside the family, something was breaking that could never be repaired. Harry and Jack had not just disagreed about HUAC, they had not just argued about testimony and tactics, they had stopped speaking entirely. The rift that had opened between them after Sam's death, the rift that Sam had always bridged through his technical authority and personal warmth, had become an unbridgeable chasm. Harry looked at Jack and saw a coward who had betrayed everything the family stood for. Jack looked at Harry and saw a sanctimonious older brother who had never given him credit for anything, who had always treated him as the irresponsible youngest child even as he ran the studio's daily operations. The brothers who had built an empire together, who had survived pogroms and immigration, and the Edison Trust and the Depression and 2 wars were about to tear that empire apart. What happened in '56 would become the most infamous betrayal in Hollywood history, a wound so deep that it would follow the Warner name for generations. In 1956, Jack Warner convinced his brothers to sell the studio, then secretly bought it back for himself, betraying Harry in a way that would kill him. The decision to sell Warner Brothers came after years of declining fortunes and increasing despair about the future of the movie business. Television had transformed American entertainment, drawing audiences away from theaters and into their living rooms. The Paramount Decree had stripped the studios of their guaranteed distribution networks. The blacklist had poisoned the creative atmosphere and driven talented people out of the industry. Harry Warner was 74 years old, tired of fighting, tired of adapting to an industry that seemed determined to destroy everything he had built. Albert was 62 and had never been the driving force behind anything. Jack was 64 and restless, frustrated by decades of being treated as the junior partner, despite running the studio's daily operations. The 3 surviving brothers looked at Warner Brothers and saw a company that had peaked, that would require massive new investment to compete in the television age. That might be worth more sold than retained. They agreed to find a buyer. The deal that emerged involved a group led by Simon Fabian, a Boston banker with experience in theatrical exhibition. Fabian's consortium offered approximately $22 million for the Warner Brothers combined shares, a price that reflected both the company's diminished circumstances and the brothers' eagerness to exit. Harry would receive roughly $8 million. Albert would receive a similar amount, Jack would receive his share, and finally be free of his brother's oversight. The sale was announced and the financial community assumed that the Warner era was ending, that the studio founded by immigrant cobblers' sons would pass into the hands of corporate managers who had no personal connection to its history. What nobody knew, what Harry and Albert did not discover until it was too late, was that Jack had negotiated a separate arrangement. While his brothers believed they were all selling together, walking away together, ending their involvement together, Jack had secretly arranged with Fabian's group to buy back a controlling interest in the company. The mechanism was an option to repurchase 800,000 shares at $25 per share, an option that would give Jack majority control of Warner Brothers after the sale closed. He would go from being one of 3 brothers sharing ownership to being the sole dominant shareholder. His brothers would be out. He would remain. The company they had built together would become his alone. The betrayal was not impulsive. It required planning, negotiation, legal documentation, all conducted in secret while Jack sat in meetings with Harry and Albert discussing the terms of their joint exit. Jack looked his brothers in the eyes, agreed to the sale, shook hands on the deal, and all the while knew that he was maneuvering to cut them out. The psychology of this deception is difficult to untangle, even with the benefit of historical distance. Jack had spent his entire adult life in his brother's shadow. Harry was the patriarch, the moral authority, the one who made the important decisions and received the important credit. Sam had been the technical genius whose vision had saved the company. Even Albert, quiet and unassuming, had his defined role in distribution and logistics. Jack ran the studio, managed the talent, oversaw the productions, but he was always the youngest, always the one whose judgment was questioned, always the one who had to defer to older brothers who thought they knew better. The resentment had accumulated over decades, every slight remembered, every dismissal catalogued, every moment when Harry had overruled him or criticised him or treated him like an irresponsible child. The HUAC testimony had deepened the rift. Harry's silent disapproval of Jack's cooperation with the committee had been more wounding than open criticism would have been. Jack knew his brother thought him a coward, knew Harry believed he had betrayed the studio's values and the family's honour. That judgment, never spoken but always present, festered in Jack's mind. If Harry thought so little of him, if Harry considered him unworthy of the Warner name, then why should Jack feel any loyalty in return? The secret buyback was revenge as much as ambition, a way to prove that Jack could outmaneuver the brother who had always underestimated him. Harry discovered the betrayal sometime after the sale closed. When the terms of Jack's separate arrangement became public knowledge, the shock was total. Harry had trusted his brother despite their conflicts, had assumed that whatever disagreements divided them, the fundamental bond of family remained intact. They had survived pogroms together. They had crossed an ocean together. They had built an empire together. The idea that Jack would deceive him so completely, would smile and agree to terms while secretly plotting to exclude him, was almost impossible to process. Harry confronted Jack. The details of that confrontation are lost to history because neither brother spoke publicly about what passed between them. What is known is that they never spoke again. The relationship that had survived 50 years of partnership, 50 years of arguments and reconciliations and shared triumphs and shared disasters, ended permanently. Harry cut Jack out of his life completely. He refused to see him, refused to take his calls, refused to acknowledge his existence. The brother who had stood beside him through everything became a stranger. Worse than a stranger, an enemy who bore the family name. The stress of the betrayal and its aftermath took a physical toll on Harry that some observers believed hastened his death. He had always been the strong one, the patriarch who held the family together, the moral centre around which the others orbited. Now that centre had collapsed. The company he had built was in someone else's hands. His brother had proven himself capable of treachery that Harry had never imagined. The meaning he had found in family loyalty and shared enterprise had been revealed as illusion. In July 1958, 19 months after discovering Jack's deception, Harry Warner suffered a massive stroke. He was 76 years old. His health had been declining, but those close to him believed that the emotional devastation of Jack's betrayal had weakened him, had drained the vitality that had sustained him through decades of struggle. The stroke left him incapacitated. He lingered for a few weeks, unable to speak, unable to move, trapped in her body that had served him for 3/4 of a century and now refused to function. Harry Warner died on July 25, 1958. His funeral was attended by family members, industry colleagues and friends who remembered the immigrant boy who had become a titan of American entertainment. Jack Warner did not attend. He sent flowers, but he did not come, whether this was because he was not welcome, because he could not face what he had done, or because he simply did not care enough to appear. The absence spoke volumes. The brother who had betrayed Harry in life could not bring himself to honour him in death. The Warner family would never recover from this rupture. Harry's descendants were effectively locked out of the company their patriarch had built. Jack's relationship with his own son, Jack Warner Jr., was permanently destroyed by the events of these years. Jack Jr. had been close to his Uncle Harry, had respected him in ways he never respected his own father. Watching Jack betray Harry, watching the family tear itself apart, watching his father's naked ambition destroy bonds that should have been sacred, changed how Jack Jr. understood his own identity. He would later write a memoir that portrayed his father as a monster, a man incapable of love or loyalty, a hollow showman who cared for nothing but his own advancement. Albert Warner, the forgotten brother, the one who had never sought the spotlight or claimed credit for the company's successes, continued in a diminished capacity after Harry's death. Albert had always been the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over conflicts and kept operations running while his brothers fought. Now there was nothing to smooth over. Harry was dead. Jack had won. The company belonged to Jack alone, and Albert had neither the desire nor the ability to challenge that reality. He faded into the background, attending board meetings, collecting his remaining shares' dividends, watching the company evolve into something he barely recognized. Albert would outlive both Harry and Jack, surviving until 1967, but his survival was invisible, unremarked, the quiet ending of a quiet man who had never wanted to be remembered. The family fortune and its destruction can be measured in numbers that reveal the scale of what was lost. The combined Warner Brothers' wealth at the time of the 1956 sale was approximately $75 million, equivalent to roughly $750 million in today's purchasing power. Harry's share was approximately $22 million. Jack's secret buyback cost him roughly $1.5 million for the option to repurchase 800,000 shares at $25 each. Jack's personal gain from the maneuver was estimated at $8 to $10 million, money that came directly from his brother's diminished stakes. Harry's medical decline followed quickly, with his stroke coming 19 months after discovering the betrayal. The family split meant that Harry's descendants were effectively locked out of the company he had built. Jack Warner Jr.'s relationship with his father was permanently destroyed, and he would later write a scathing memoir detailing his father's cruelties and manipulations. The studio Harry built was sold entirely in 1967 for $183 million to Seven Arts, a Canadian production company that saw value where the Warners saw exhaustion. Jack's personal payout from that final sale was approximately $32 million. Harry's estate at his death was valued at approximately $14 million, less than half of what his share would have been worth had he lived to see the 1967 sale. Jack ruled Warner Brothers alone for the decade following Harry's death. He was finally the undisputed boss, the sole authority, the mogul whose word was law. But the victory was hollow in ways that became apparent only over time. The studio Jack controlled was not the studio the brothers had built together. It was a diminished thing, struggling to compete in an industry that had passed the old moguls by. The contract player system that had created stars was dying. Independent producers and talented agencies were gaining power that studios could no longer match. Television was draining theatrical audiences. The vertically integrated empire the brothers had constructed over 40 years had been broken by antitrust law and technological change. Jack adapted as best he could, greenlighting projects that younger executives recommended, making deals with independent producers who brought your own financing, producing television content that would have seemed beneath the studio's dignity a generation earlier. He remained a showman, throwing parties, courting celebrities, playing the role of Hollywood royalty even as the kingdom crumbled around him. But he was increasingly a figure from another era, a relic of the studio system that had defined American entertainment for decades and was now being replaced by something messier and more democratic. The new Hollywood had no patience for autocrats like Jack Warner. Directors wanted creative control. Actors wanted profit participation. Writers wanted recognition. The talent that had once been grateful for studio contracts now demanded to be treated as partners rather than employees. Jack fought these changes, lost most of his battles, and eventually decided that the fight was no longer worth it. In 1967, he sold his remaining stake in Warner Brothers to Seven Arts for approximately $32 million. He was 75 years old. He had been in the movie business for 64 years, since that day in 1903 when Sam had come home excited about moving pictures. He had outlasted his brothers, outlasted his rivals, outlasted the studio system itself. He walked away believing he had won. Jack Warner sold Warner Brothers in 1967 and walked away with millions. He thought he was leaving on top, the last mogul standing from the golden age of Hollywood. He had outmaneuvered Harry of Dorsey-Istor. He had survived the blacklist. He had adapted to television and independent production and every other change the industry had thrown at him. He was rich, famous, respected in the way that very old and very wealthy men are always respected, regardless of how they accumulated their wealth. But the studio he sold would outlive his influence by generations. It would create Batman and Harry Potter and the DC Universe. It would merge with Time Incorporated, then AT&T, then Discovery. The name Warner Brothers would appear on screens around the world long after anyone remembered who the actual brothers were. The question that remains is what they really built, and what it means that 4 Jewish refugees from Poland invented the American Dream Factory. The Warner Brothers have been dead for decades. But the machine they built now generates $40 billion annually and shapes how the entire world tells stories. The sale to Seven Arts in 1967 marked the end of family control, though the family name remained on the logo as it does to this day. Warner Brothers Seven Arts became the new corporate identity, a hyphenated hybrid that satisfied lawyers and accountants while erasing the human beings who had built the company from nothing. Seven Arts was a Canadian production company that specialised in acquiring undervalued entertainment assets, and they saw in Warner Brothers a catalogue of valuable films, a functioning production operation, and a brand name that still meant something to audiences worldwide. What they did not see, what they could not have understood, was what it meant to transform a family business into a corporate holding. The brothers who had fled pogroms and fought Edison and invented sound and survived the Depression had operated on instinct and passion and desperate immigrant hunger. The executives who replaced them operated on spreadsheets and market analysis and quarterly earnings reports. Both approaches could make money. Only one could make meaning. The Seven Arts era lasted barely 2 years before another transformation reshaped the company entirely. In 1969, Kinney National Company, a conglomerate that had grown from parking lots and funeral homes into a diversified holding company, acquired Warner Brothers Seven Arts for approximately $400 million. The man behind Kinney was Steve Ross, a figure whose background would have seemed familiar to the original Warner Brothers. Ross was also Jewish, the son of immigrants, a self-made businessman who had clawed his way up from modest origins. He saw in Warner Brothers not just a film studio, but the foundation for something larger, a diversified entertainment empire that would span music, publishing, cable television, and eventually the entire media landscape. Ross was building what the Warners had dreamed of but never achieved, a company that could dominate multiple forms of entertainment simultaneously. The irony was exquisite and painful. The brothers had spent their lives fighting for control of a single studio, had torn their family apart over ownership of one company, and now an outsider was using that company as a building block for an empire that would dwarf anything they had imagined. Ross renamed the company Warner Communications and began acquiring businesses that complemented the film operation. Atlantic Records brought music. DC Comics brought intellectual property that would prove invaluable decades later. Cable television systems brought distribution. Atari brought video games. The conglomerate that Ross assembled bore the Warner name, but had almost nothing to do with the brothers who had made that name famous. Jack Warner watched these developments from the sidelines with emotions that must have been complicated beyond description. He had sold the company believing he was getting out at the top, cashing in before the industry declined further, walking away with his fortune intact. Instead, he watched others take what he had built and make it bigger, more profitable, more culturally dominant than it had ever been under his control. He spent his final years attending parties that celebrated a Hollywood that no longer existed, writing memoirs that portrayed himself as the hero of every story, nursing grievances against brothers who were dead and colleagues who had forgotten him. Jack Warner died in '78 at the age of 86. His funeral was attended by industry figures who remembered the golden age he represented, but the eulogies were perfunctory, the tributes generic. He had lived too long, outlasted his era, become a relic before he stopped breathing. The showman who had craved attention his entire life exited to polite applause, rather than standing ovations. Albert Warner, the forgotten brother, had died in 1967, the same year the studio was sold to Seven Arts. He was 83 years old and had spent his final years in quiet obscurity, attending board meetings out of habit, watching the company evolve into something unrecognizable, never seeking credit or attention. Albert had always been the invisible brother, the one who handled logistics and distribution while others claimed the spotlight. His death barely registered in the press. His contributions to the company's success were acknowledged in brief obituaries and then forgotten. Of the four brothers who had built Warner Brothers, Albert's ending was perhaps the saddest because it was the most anonymous. He had worked just as hard as his siblings, had sacrificed just as much, had taken the same risks and faced the same challenges, but history would remember him as a footnote if it remembered him at all. Sam Warner remained the most tragic figure of all, dead at 40 before the sound revolution he created had fully transformed the industry, buried the day his masterpiece premiered, never knowing that his gamble had succeeded beyond anything he had imagined. The brother who had seen the future most clearly was the only one who never got to live in it. His widow and children received their share of the profits from sound films, but money could not compensate for the loss of the visionary who had made that money possible. Sam's descendants would watch the company grow and transform over decades, would see the Warner name on properties that generated billions of dollars, would know that none of it would have existed without their father and grandfather, and would also know that almost nobody else knew or cared about that history. The corporate evolution of Warner Brothers after Jack's departure accelerated in ways that would have been incomprehensible to the founding generation. Steve Ross continued building his empire through the 1970s and 80s, turning Warner Communications into one of the largest media companies in the world. In 1990, Warner Communications merged with Time Incorporated to create Time Warner, a combination that brought together film, television, magazines, book publishing, and cable systems under a single corporate umbrella. The merged company had a market capitalization of approximately $15 billion, making it the largest media enterprise in history at that point. The Warner name survived the merger, attached to the film and television operations, while Time provided print and publishing assets. Harry and Sam and Albert and Jack had built a movie studio. Their successors had built a media empire that touched virtually every form of communication and entertainment. The 2000 merger with America Online represented the peak of corporate hubris and the beginning of catastrophic decline. AOL was an internet service provider that achieved massive valuations during the dot-com bubble, and its executives convinced themselves and the Time Warner board that the future of media lay in combining traditional content with internet distribution. The merger was valued at $164 billion, the largest corporate combination in history. It was also one of the worst business decisions ever made. The dot-com bubble burst almost immediately after the merger closed. AOL's subscriber base began declining as broadband internet replaced dial-up connections. The synergies that had been promised never materialized. The cultures of the two companies clashed catastrophically. Time Warner stock, which had traded at $100 per share at the merger's announcement, collapsed to $8.70 by 2002. Over $200 billion in shareholder value was destroyed. The company that the Warner Brothers had started with $150 for a used projector had become a case study in corporate destruction. The corporate evolution in numbers tells the story of transformation beyond anything the founders could have imagined. The 1967 Seven Arts sale was valued at $183 million. The 1989 Time Warner merger created a company with combined market capitalization of $15 billion. The 2000 AOL merger was valued at $164 billion, the largest in history at that time. Peak stock price before the crash reached $100 per share. The post-merger low hit $8.70 in 2002. Value destroyed exceeded $200 billion. The 2018 AT&T acquisition cost $85 billion. The 2022 Discovery spin-off created a company valued at approximately $43 billion. Warner Brothers Discovery current annual revenue exceeds $40 billion. To put this in perspective, the brothers started with $150 for a used projector in 1903. The company they founded now generates more revenue in a single day than they earned in their first decade combined. Properties created under the Warner Brothers banner that the founders never saw include the Harry Potter franchise with $9.2 billion in box office revenue, the DC Extended Universe with $6 billion, the Matrix trilogy with $1.6 billion, and HBO original programming that has won 24 Emmy Awards for Best Series. The brothers' names still appear on the logo, on every property, seen by billions of people annually who have no idea who those brothers were or what they sacrificed to put that name there. The journey from AOL disaster to current corporate structure involved multiple additional transformations. Time Warner eventually dropped the AOL name and sold off the struggling internet business. The company refocused on content creation and distribution, investing heavily in HBO, which had grown from a small cable channel into the prestige television brand that defined quality entertainment. Warner Brothers continued producing films that dominated global box office, including the Harry Potter franchise and Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy and the DC Extended Universe. In 2018, AT&T acquired Time Warner for $85 billion, believing that combining content with telecommunications distribution would create competitive advantages in the streaming era. That theory proved as flawed as the AOL synergy thesis had been. AT&T struggled to integrate the media business, lost subscribers to competitors, and eventually decided to spin off the entertainment and assets. In 2022, Warner Brothers merged with Discovery to create Warner Brothers Discovery, yet another corporate combination designed to achieve scale in an increasingly competitive streaming landscape. The brothers who had started showing films in converted storefronts would not recognize anything about the business that bears their name today. The question of legacy haunts the Warner Brothers story in ways that extend beyond corporate valuations and franchise revenues. 4 Jewish immigrants from Poland built something that shaped how America understood itself. Their films during the Depression gave voice to working people and outsiders. Their films during World War II told Americans why they were fighting and what they were fighting for. Their invention of sound transformed entertainment from a novelty into the dominant art form of the 20th century. They did all of this while facing discrimination, persecution, and suspicion from the very country they were helping to define. The anti-Semitism that had driven their family from Poland followed them to America in different forms, questioning their loyalty, doubting their motives, suggesting that their success proved something sinister about Jewish influence rather than something admirable about immigrant determination. Hollywood's Jewish origins became a subject of careful silence for decades after the studio era ended. The moguls themselves had downplayed their backgrounds, anglicizing names, avoiding Jewish content, trying to assimilate into an America that would never fully accept them. Their children and grandchildren often knew little about the Shtetls and pogroms that had shaped their ancestors. The story of how Jewish refugees invented American popular culture was hidden not by conspiracy, but by shame and fear, by the reasonable calculation that drawing attention to Jewish achievement would only fuel anti-Semitic resentment. Only in recent decades has this history been recovered and celebrated, as scholars and filmmakers have examined how outsiders created the insider culture, how people who were excluded from American institutions built the institution that would define American identity to the world. The Warner Brothers story is ultimately about what happens when outsiders build something that defines the culture that excluded them. 4 boys from a Polish Shtetl, sons of a cobbler who could not read English, invented the technology that killed silent film. They made movies that told America how to think about crime, about war, about itself. They fought fascism before it was popular, then named names when the government came for them. They built an empire together and destroyed their family fighting over it. Harry died thinking Jack had stolen everything. Jack died alone, writing memoirs nobody read, throwing parties nobody remembered. Albert died forgotten entirely. Sam, the visionary who made it all possible, died the day before his revolution premiered. He never heard an audience gasp at the sound of Al Jolson's voice. But here is the thing that matters more than any of the tragedy or triumph. The machine they built is still running. Every time you watch a Warner Brothers film, you're watching what 4 Jewish refugees created when they refused to accept that America was not for them. They did not just assimilate, they built the factory that manufactured American identity. The Warner Brothers did not just make movies, they made the dreams, and dreams, it turns out, outlive the dreamers. That is the real legacy. Not the money, not the studio, not the corporate mergers or the stock prices or the franchise revenues. The real legacy is the fact that 4 immigrants from Poland invented how the world imagines itself, and the world still does not know their names.